Imagine spending 70 years building the most powerful military machine the world has ever seen. Imagine arming your closest allies, writing their defense contracts, training their soldiers, and making sure that no matter what happens in the world, they always need you. You are the supplier. You are the protector. You are the one who decides who gets the most advanced weapons and who does not. You hold all the keys, and the doors that matter most can only be opened from your side. Now imagine waking up one morning and realizing, slowly, quietly, and without any dramatic warning, that the country you armed the most, the country you trusted the most, the country that has bought more weapons from you than any other nation on earth, is no longer waiting for you to show up. It is building its own weapons now. It is calling China for the parts you refuse to send. It is setting up factories. Right now, today, this week, while you are sitting in committee hearings and reading strategy papers about other parts of the world, to manufacture the very systems you spent decades selling them at enormous profit. And it is doing all of this with a smile on its face while still sitting at your table, still signing your deals, still shaking your hand, still using the word ally as easily as it ever did. The press releases still say partnership. The diplomatic language is still warm. The photo opportunities still happen. But underneath all of that warmth, something structural is shifting. Something that took 50 years to build is being quietly, methodically, and very skillfully taken apart. Not from the outside, from the inside. Not by an enemy, by a friend who has finally decided that friendship built on dependency is not something it can afford anymore. That country is Saudi Arabia. And the feeling creeping through the halls of the Pentagon right now, that cold, quiet anxiety that nobody wants to say out loud in a press briefing or put in a public statement, that feeling has a name. It is called fear, not the fear of a bullet. Not the fear of a missile streaking toward a naval vessel or a tank column crossing a border. This is a deeper, slower, more structural kind of fear. The fear of losing control without a single shot being fired. The fear of watching the most strategically important relationship the United States has maintained in the Middle East for half a century, quietly, carefully, and with great deliberateness, slip out of American hands. Not through betrayal, not through war, not through any sudden dramatic act, but through competence, through patience. Through a kingdom that spent decades at the dependent end of the world's most lucrative arms relationship, and finally decided it was going to change that status permanently. This is not a story about war between the United States and Saudi Arabia. There is no war on the horizon between them. This is a story about something more subtle and, in some ways, more consequential than a war. It is a story about leverage, about who controls the weapons of the future, about who writes the next generation of defense contracts, about a desert kingdom that built its entire security architecture on American foundations, and then decided, with cold strategic clarity, that building on someone else's foundations was a vulnerability it could no longer afford. And it is a story about how that single, quiet, carefully calculated decision is now sending shockwaves through Washington that nobody, not the generals, not the diplomats, not the defense secretaries, not the national security advisors, knows how to fully contain. Let us go all the way back to the beginning. Because to understand where Saudi Arabia is going and why the trajectory is generating genuine alarm among people who have spent their careers managing American military power, you need to understand where it has been, and just how deep, how structural, and how deliberately constructed that American dependency really was. For the better part of 5 decades, Saudi Arabia was the definition of a perfect American ally in the Middle East. It sat on top of one of the world's largest concentrations of easily recoverable oil, reserves that the entire modern global economy depended on flowing at predictable volumes and at prices that kept the industrial world functioning. It bought American weapons in volumes that no other nation came anywhere close to matching. Year after year, decade after decade, administration after administration. Regardless of which party controlled Washington, regardless of what else was happening in the world, the Saudi weapons purchases kept coming, and they kept being enormous. It kept the oil markets stable when they needed to be stable. It played a central and often decisive role in containing Iranian ambitions in a region where Iranian power could destabilize everything from energy supply to American military basing rights. It hosted American forces when it needed to. It shared intelligence when it was asked to. It provided diplomatic cover when America needed a friendly Arab voice to validate difficult decisions that its European allies were uncomfortable publicly endorsing. In the language of strategic analysis, Saudi Arabia was a cornerstone, not just an important ally, but a load-bearing one. One of the relationships whose removal would require rebuilding the entire architecture of American influence in the region from scratch. Washington understood this clearly and treated the relationship accordingly, protected it politically through multiple crises, insulated it from human rights concerns that would have ended relationships with less strategically important countries, gave Saudi Arabia access to weapons and technology that America restricted from nearly every other nation. And in return, America gave Saudi Arabia something genuinely valuable, Real, credible protection against real threats. F-15 Eagle fighter jets that could outperform anything operated by any neighboring air force. Patriot advanced capability. Missile batteries capable of intercepting ballistic missiles in their terminal phase. Abrams tanks. Advanced attack helicopters. Precision-guided munitions. Satellite intelligence about Iranian military movements. And the constant, unmistakable presence of the United States Navy in the Persian Gulf. Aircraft carrier strike groups whose presence alone represented a deterrent that no regional power could easily calculate around. Saudi Arabia was the largest arms customer the United States has ever had. But it was also something more than a customer in the commercial sense. It was structurally dependent in a way that was operationally significant. Its Air Force ran on American aircraft that required American spare parts, supplied through American logistics contracts. Its air defense systems were built on American technology that required ongoing American technical support to remain operational. Its military training was conducted by American advisors using American doctrine and American equipment. The relationship was not transactional in the way that a one-time purchase is transactional. It was woven into the operational capacity of Saudi military power at every level. That structural dependency was not an accident from Washington's perspective. It was a design feature. It meant that Saudi Arabia could not suddenly change direction, realign with a competing power, or adopt policies deeply hostile to American interests without paying an enormous cost in military degradation. The leverage was real, measurable, and deliberately maintained. And for decades, it functioned exactly as designed. But Mohammed bin Salman looked at that same dependency and saw something that Washington never intended him to see quite so clearly. He saw a trap. Because here is the fundamental reality of depending on someone else for your weapons. When they decide to stop selling, for any reason, for any domestic political calculation, for any pressure from any lobby or any human rights report or any allied government with a conflicting strategic interest, you have nothing. Your Air Force cannot fly without spare parts. Your missile defense systems cannot be maintained without American technical teams. Your training pipelines dry up. Your operational readiness degrades week by week, and there's nothing you can do about it, because every critical system in your military was designed to be serviced by the people who built it and who have now decided to stop. Mohammed bin Salman had watched Congress periodically threaten to block Saudi arms sales over the Yemen war. He had watched American politicians use Saudi Arabia's military dependency as leverage to extract diplomatic concessions. He had seen how a single vote in Washington, motivated entirely by American domestic politics and completely disconnected from Saudi security needs, could freeze weapons deliveries that Saudi Arabia needed. He understood that, however strong the relationship felt in good times, its foundation was American political will. And American political will could change with an election, a news cycle, or a particularly effective pressure campaign. That was not sovereignty. That was Siwanya Astaus. He launched Vision 2030. And buried quietly inside the language about economic diversification, tourism development, and technology investment was a military goal that most outside observers significantly underestimated. Saudi Arabia would produce 50% of its own defense equipment domestically by 2030. Half of its own weapons, built on Saudi soil, by Saudi workers, controlled by Saudi institutions. Beyond the reach of any foreign congressional vote, any foreign export approval process, any foreign political calculation about whether Saudi Arabia deserved to have working weapons this year. The number seemed implausible when it was announced. Saudi Arabia had no history of defense manufacturing, no industrial base with the precision machining, advanced electronics, material science, and systems integration expertise that modern weapons production requires. It had essentially unlimited capital, but money alone had never been enough to build a defense industry in the timeframes Vision 2030 was discussing. Analysts wrote papers about why 50% was impossible. And then Saudi Arabia started doing it. And it moved with a speed and a focus that made the skeptics start revising their assessments. The organizational vehicle was SAMI, Saudi Arabian Military Industries, established in 2017 with a single driving mandate: make Saudi Arabia a defense producer. And SAMI's stated target was not humble: entry into the global top 25 defense companies by 2030. Not the Arab world's top 5, the global top 25. On the same ranking as Lockheed Martin, Raytheon Technologies, BAE Systems, Boeing Defense, and Northrop Grumman. Companies whose histories span World War II, the Cold War, and every military technology generation since. Companies that collectively employ hundreds of thousands of engineers and scientists, and whose combined research investment over the decades has funded the development of stealth aircraft, precision-guided munitions, satellite guidance systems, and the entire architecture of modern networked warfare. Saudi Arabia, with zero meaningful indigenous defense production 10 years ago, is targeting a seat in that company's league by the end of this decade. And when you look at the specific capabilities it is pursuing, you understand why Washington's assessment has shifted from polite skepticism to something that reads much more like genuine alarm. Saudi Arabia is not trying to catch up to yesterday's battlefield. It is not attempting to replicate Cold War-era platforms or reverse engineer technology from the 1990s. It has watched Ukraine, where cheap commercial-derived drones decided tactical outcomes that doctrine a decade-old never anticipated. It watched Houthi drones and cruise missiles punch through sophisticated, expensive American-supplied air defenses and destroy Saudi oil infrastructure on international television, a humiliation that made every argument for strategic independence viscerally concrete. It watched Nagorno-Karabakh, where Azerbaijani drone operations collapsed an entire Armenian defensive posture in days, demonstrating that the era of autonomous aerial systems deciding ground combat outcomes was not a future speculation, but a present reality. Saudi Arabia looked at all of that and arrived at a conclusion that was both obvious and revolutionary. The next war will be determined by whoever can field the most capable autonomous systems in the greatest numbers at the lowest cost. And autonomous systems, unlike the fighter jets and tank formations of the previous era, are not built primarily on decades of industrial heritage. They are built on software, on data, on algorithms, and on the willingness to invest aggressively in the engineering talent that writes them, all of which can be acquired faster than a conventional defense industrial base can be constructed. In 2024, Saudi Arabia purchased China's Winglong 10B unmanned combat aerial vehicle, an AI-enabled armed drone capable of precision strike missions with minimal human direction. The decision to buy this system from China, rather than from the United States or a European supplier, was not a passive procurement decision driven by availability or price. It was a deliberate strategic signal. It told Washington that when American political processes delay or block weapons sales that Saudi Arabia needs, Saudi Arabia finds other suppliers, and finds capable ones. But the Winglong was the opening move in a much larger strategy, not the strategy itself. As of today, Saudi Arabia has more than 9 separate and simultaneous domestic drone development programs operating inside its borders. 9 parallel tracks of research, development, testing, and early production, each aimed at a different operational capability gap that has been identified through direct combat experience fighting the Houthis over years of real conflict in difficult terrain. That is not a country experimenting with drone technology. That is a country that has decided autonomous systems are the foundation of its military future and is investing in every dimension of that future at the same time. And then came the announcement from Turkey's Baykar, the manufacturer of the Bayraktar TB2 combat drone that became one of the defining weapon systems of the war in Ukraine. That production lines for its more advanced Akıncı UCAV were being physically constructed inside Saudi Arabia, not exported to Saudi Arabia fully assembled, not delivered as kits for simple integration, manufactured inside Saudi Arabia by Saudi workers trained by Baykar engineers under a formal joint venture with SAMI, described as the largest Turkish defense industrial agreement in history. The Akıncı carries AI-guided cruise missiles and can integrate supersonic weapons. It flies extended combat missions at high altitude with advanced onboard autonomy that enables targeting and routing decisions with minimal human direction. The first Saudi-assembled Akıncı units are expected off the production line in 2026. Within the next year, Saudi Arabia will be a manufacturer of AI-enabled combat drones. That sentence could not have been written in 2015. It is the current operational reality. And still, this is not the development generating the deepest alarm inside the American defense establishment. That belongs to a piece of software called HiveMind. Reports confirmed in 2025 that Saudi Arabia was in active negotiations with American AI startup Shield AI over its autonomous flight platform. HiveMind-powered drones require no GPS, no communications link, and no human operator at any point during a mission. They can complete an entire combat mission cycle: takeoff, navigation, target identification, engagement decision, and return, completely independently, in fully degraded electronic environments where every satellite signal is blocked and every radio frequency is jammed. The VBAT variant flies autonomously for 13 hours. The XBAT combat variant launches vertically from ships and operates without any external support whatsoever. Connect HiveMind to the Akıncı production lines. Connect those to the 9 parallel drone programs. Connect all of that to the Winglong purchase, to the AI-native military architecture declared publicly at the World Defense Show 2026 in Riyadh, where Saudi officials described weapon systems designed from their first line of code to have artificial intelligence at their core, owning the full technology stack from semiconductor to autonomous combat agent. And what you see is not a country with a better arms procurement strategy. You see a country redesigning the concept of what a military actually is. And underneath all of the impressive technology, underneath the drones and the AI declarations and the production lines going up in the Saudi desert, sits the fear that is older and deeper than any single weapon system. The fear that is, in the end, what the Pentagon is actually afraid of. China. Not Saudi Arabia becoming capable. The American military can work with a capable ally. They have done it before. What generates genuine, high-level, sustained strategic anxiety is the scenario where Saudi Arabia's growing military technological infrastructure becomes entangled with Chinese systems at the data and AI layer, where Chinese technology is processing Saudi operational data, learning from Saudi mission profiles, being maintained by Chinese engineers who have access to Saudi defense networks, and feeding information back to Chinese military intelligence that would represent one of the most significant intelligence windfalls in the history of the bilateral competition between Beijing and Washington. That scenario is not a think tank hypothetical. It is developing. The Winglong 10B runs on Chinese systems. Saudi Arabia has Chinese DF-21 ballistic missiles in its inventory, a purchase that caused sufficient alarm in Washington that American officials raised it directly with Saudi leadership at a diplomatic level. The multi-sourcing strategy that protects Saudi Arabia's political independence simultaneously creates technical and data relationships with Chinese defense companies that Washington cannot monitor or control. And here's the thing that makes modern AI-enabled weapons fundamentally different from the tanks and fighter jets of the previous era. They learn, they update, they require ongoing data exchange, software maintenance, and technical relationships with their developers. An F-15 in a Saudi hangar can sit there for 20 years without the Americans needing to do much with it. An AI-enabled drone system requires a living technical relationship with its developer, regular data feeds, algorithm updates, performance telemetry flowing back to the engineering team. If that developer is Chinese, that relationship gives China persistent access to the operational data of one of the most strategically positioned militaries on Earth. Not a one-time intelligence collection. Persistent, ongoing operational access. This is what the $142 billion deal announced in May 2025, the largest military cooperation agreement in American history, according to the White House itself, is trying to address. Washington is trying to keep American technology at the center of Saudi military modernization, so that it is American systems processing the data, American engineers maintaining the relationships, and American intelligence that benefits from the operational learning. But the deal is enormously complicated. $142 billion represents 176% of Saudi Arabia's annual defense budget, which tells you the number is partly a strategic signal and partly an operational plan. And inside the deal are commitments that simultaneously reveal what Saudi Arabia wants and why delivering it creates new problems. Saudi Arabia wants the F-35, America's most advanced combat aircraft, carrying stealth architecture, sensor fusion systems, and networked warfare capabilities that represent the cutting edge of what American aviation technology has achieved. Giving Saudi Arabia the F-35 would directly challenge Israel's qualitative military edge, the long-standing American commitment that Israeli defense capability stays ahead of any regional rival. Israel's objections carry real political weight in Washington, and Congress has already signaled the F-35 sale could be blocked. Every delay adds another argument to the Saudi case for building its own advanced fighter capability through partnerships that do not require congressional approval. Meanwhile, THAAD's technology transfer is already producing Saudi-manufactured components. Lockheed Martin engineers meeting with Saudi counterparts in Jeddah to mark the completion of domestically produced parts of one of the most advanced missile defense systems America operates. Raytheon training Saudi engineers to maintain Patriot batteries on Saudi soil. The technology is transferring, the knowledge is moving. And knowledge, unlike a physical weapon, cannot be recalled once it is inside another country's engineering culture. Saudi Arabia's drone sector alone was valued at $314 million in 2025, projected to more than double to $735 million by 2034, driven almost entirely by domestic production capacity being built right now. The Houthi war turned theoretical arguments about strategic independence into immediate operational necessity. When autonomous weapons destroy your oil infrastructure in real time on international news channels, you stop debating whether you need to build your own autonomous weapons, and you start building them. And then there is the nuclear dimension. In 2025, reporting confirmed that Mohammed bin Salman's requests to Washington included American nuclear weapons stationed on Saudi soil, a permanent deterrent against the existential threat of Iranian nuclear capability. The mere existence of that request in any conversation tells you more about the state of the relationship than 1,000 diplomatic cables. It tells you that Saudi Arabia does not believe American security guarantees, in their current form, are sufficient to guarantee the kingdom's survival in a worst-case scenario. And the American answer to that question shapes everything that comes after. A yes creates a dependency so absolute that independence becomes structurally impossible. A no sends Riyadh looking for a deterrent elsewhere. The elsewhere that comes to mind first is Beijing. Every chapter of this story, every technology decision, every partnership, every negotiation ends at the same geopolitical intersection: Washington and Beijing, the two competing centers of global power. And Saudi Arabia, with extraordinary strategic sophistication for a country that spent 50 years being managed, positioned squarely in the middle, being courted by both. Saudi Arabia is not America's enemy. It is not becoming China's ally. Mohammed bin Salman is not executing a betrayal. He is executing a rational strategy, arguably the most rational strategy available to the leader of a wealthy, energy-rich nation in a dangerous neighborhood with nuclear-armed regional adversaries. He is building enough independent capability through enough diversified partnerships that no single foreign government can ever again make Saudi Arabia's security conditional on Saudi Arabia's compliance. The problem for Washington is not that Saudi Arabia wants independence. Every serious nation wants independence. America built its own defense industrial base for precisely that reason. The problem is that Saudi Arabia is achieving it, with technology more advanced than expected, at a speed faster than predicted, through partnerships that include Beijing, and through a strategy sophisticated enough to maintain the relationship with Washington while systematically dismantling the dependency that gave Washington its leverage. The tools America built to maintain strategic influence: arms sales that create dependency, technology transfers that require ongoing maintenance relationships, security guarantees that require ongoing American involvement, are exactly the tools Saudi Arabia is quietly retiring. Not loudly, not confrontationally, but permanently. And the window where Washington could meaningfully reshape that trajectory is closing. The factories are built or being built. The engineers are trained or being trained. The production lines are running or will be running. Every month that passes, Saudi Arabia's autonomous military capability advances another increment, and the leverage that American defense policy depended on retreats another increment with it. When the Akinchu rolls off the Saudi assembly line in 2026, when HiveMind Software is managing Saudi drone operations, when SAMI makes the global top 25, when the F-35 question has been answered one way or another, the relationship will still exist, the oil will still flow, the diplomatic meetings will still happen, the alliance language will still be used, but the structural reality underneath that language will have fundamentally changed. The dependency will be gone, and the question Washington cannot answer, the question that is actually generating the fear, is what holds a 50-year alliance together when the dependency that built it has been engineered away. Nobody in the Pentagon has a clean answer to that question. And while they look for one, the manufacturing lines in Riyadh do not pause for the debate. One drone at a time, one factory at a time, one decision at a time, until the day the Crown Prince picks up the phone, and for the first time in 50 years, does not need to call Washington. That day is closer than anyone in the Pentagon wants to admit. And that is precisely what makes them afraid. Now set that technological picture aside for a moment. Set aside the drones, the HiveMind software, the Akinchu production lines, the 9 parallel programs, the AI native declarations from the World Defense Show stage. Set aside all of the impressive hardware and consider just the human dimension of what is happening. Saudi Arabia is building something that no amount of weapon sales can easily replace: institutional knowledge, engineering culture, the accumulated practical competence that comes from not just buying weapons, but designing them, testing them, breaking them, fixing them, improving them, and teaching the next generation of engineers how to do the same. That kind of institutional knowledge, once it exists, is permanent. It compounds. It creates capabilities that are not in any catalog and cannot be measured by counting aircraft or missile batteries. America spent the Cold War building exactly that kind of institutional knowledge in its own defense sector. The engineers who designed the F-22 learned from the engineers who designed the F-15. The people who built the Patriot system created the knowledge base that made THAAD possible. Capability compounds across generations, and the United States benefited enormously from that compounding for decades. Saudi Arabia is now beginning that same process. It is at the very early stages of the compounding curve, but it is on the curve. And once a country is on that curve, the momentum is very difficult to reverse. The knowledge does not go away when a government changes or a defense budget fluctuates. It is embedded in people, in institutions, in universities that teach the principles, in factories that demonstrate the practice. This is the deepest reason why the American concern goes beyond any specific weapon system. It is not really about the Winglong 10B. It is not really about HiveMind or the Akinchu or SAMI's ranking ambitions. It is about what happens 20 years from now when Saudi Arabia has an entire generation of engineers who grew up inside a domestic defense industry, who designed their own drones, built their own AI systems, developed their own autonomous platforms, whose entire professional identity is built around Saudi capability rather than American dependency. That generation will not think about the American relationship the way previous generations did. They will not see American weapons as the natural, inevitable source of Saudi military power. They will see American weapons as one option among many, and possibly not the best option for every requirement, given that they will know how to build many of those requirements themselves. Washington is not just losing leverage over a procurement relationship, it is watching the conditions develop that will make the leverage permanently unavailable in the future. And there is no obvious policy response to that, because the process driving it is the normal, legitimate ambition of a sovereign nation to control its own security. The strategic challenge America faces with Saudi Arabia is genuinely novel. In the history of American arms relationships, the dependency model has mostly worked. Countries that buy American weapons keep buying American weapons because the systems interoperate, the training is compatible, and the supply chains are already established. Switching costs are real and significant. Alliance relationships built on military dependency have historically been durable. But Saudi Arabia is not switching from American systems to other foreign systems in a way that simply replaces one dependency with another. It is building the capacity to not depend on anyone. It is manufacturing that independence domestically. And when the manufacturing is mature, the switching cost calculus changes permanently. At that point, the American relationship has to justify itself on merit, on whether American technology, American partnership, and American strategic cooperation is genuinely more valuable than the alternatives, rather than on the inertia of established dependency. That is a competition America is not certain it can win, especially if Chinese AI systems are embedded in Saudi military infrastructure before Washington figures out how to respond, especially if the F-35 sale is blocked and Saudi Arabia draws the obvious conclusions about American reliability, especially if MBS's nuclear request is refused and Saudi Arabia turns to Beijing for the deterrent assurance that Washington declined to provide. The irony at the heart of this entire story is stark. America's enormous success in building Saudi Arabia into a major military customer created the wealth and confidence that enabled Saudi Arabia to decide it no longer needed to be a customer. The weapons sales that were supposed to create leverage created capability. The capability funded ambition. The ambition is now systematically eliminating the leverage. And there is no playbook for this, no historical precedent that quite captures the combination of an indispensable energy relationship, a long-standing military partnership, a Chinese competitor actively courting the same ally, and a domestic defense ambition moving at a speed that previous conventional wisdom said was impossible. Washington will keep engaging. The deals will keep being signed. The relationship will keep being described as strong. And all of that will be true in a formal sense. But the structural reality, that the dependency architecture that was the actual foundation of American influence, will keep eroding, one factory at a time, one program at a time, one generation of Saudi engineers at a time, until one day the relationship looks exactly like a partnership between equals, which sounds positive until you remember that a partnership between equals gives America no more influence in Riyadh than China, Turkey, or South Korea. That is the destination this trajectory leads to. Not enmity, not war, just irrelevance. The slow, quiet, thoroughly earned irrelevance of a patron whose protection is no longer necessary. And that, in the end, is the fear that has no easy answer. Not a fear of Saudi Arabia becoming an enemy, a fear of Saudi Arabia becoming simply independent, capable, sovereign in the deepest sense, no longer in need of anything America uniquely provides. That day is not here yet, but the factories in Riyadh are running, and it is coming. Think about what this means for the next American president, and the one after that. Every administration that inherits the Middle East portfolio will inherit a Saudi Arabia that is slightly more capable, slightly more independent, and slightly less in need of what Washington is offering. The trajectory is not reversible through any single deal or any single diplomatic initiative. It is baked into the industrial momentum that Vision 2030 has set in motion. The factories being built today will still be operating in 30 years. The engineers being trained today will be running those factories in 20 years. The institutional knowledge being built today will compound through the next generation. The United States faces a version of this challenge in several places around the world. Allies and partners who are becoming too capable to need American protection in the old dependency sense. But nowhere is the scale of the strategic stakes higher. Nowhere is the Chinese alternative more actively competitive. And nowhere has the transition happened faster or more deliberately than in Saudi Arabia. What Washington can still do is compete for the relationship on merit, offer technology that China cannot match, offer security frameworks that provide genuine deterrence at a cost Saudi Arabia cannot replicate domestically, offer a vision of partnership that is more attractive than the alternatives, build a relationship that Saudi Arabia chooses freely rather than one it maintains because it has no other option. That is a harder sale to make than the dependency model. It requires America to be genuinely useful rather than just structurally necessary. It requires competing with China on quality and reliability rather than relying on switching costs. It requires accepting that Saudi Arabia is a sovereign power making sovereign choices and finding ways to make the American choice genuinely compelling. Whether Washington can do that, whether it has the strategic flexibility, the political will, and the policy creativity to compete for the Saudi relationship in a world where Saudi Arabia no longer needs to depend on anyone, is perhaps the defining question of American Middle East policy for the next generation. The answer is not yet clear, but the clock is running, the production lines are operating, and Saudi Arabia, for the first time in 50 years, is making its own choices about its own future, on its own timeline, with its own technology. That is not a crisis. That is a reckoning. And Washington, whether it is ready or not, is in the middle of it,